3, 2, and 1.
Okay, so this is Senate Government Operations. We're back. We took a little break. And just to pre-warn people, the Senate has been having some difficulties with some technology difficulties today. So this morning it happened to committees, and during the floor session today it happened. We got kicked offline or off YouTube, I guess that's what it's called. So if that happens, we have to stop what we're doing. Those are our directions, and we can chat among ourselves, but we really can't do any substantive work until we get back on. And Gail is working really hard to make sure we stay back on. But I just want to warn people that if that happens, that's why. It isn't that we're not interested in broadcasting what we're doing, but it's technical difficulties on the YouTube end. So with that, we're a little bit late getting started this afternoon, but we are going to be looking at, I believe it's JRS2 is the actual title of it, and it, yes, JRH2. And it is a resolution that is an official apology from the General Assembly for the General Assembly's actions around the eugenics movement. So with that, I think that what we'll do is start with people we haven't heard from yet. And so I think what I'll do is start with Rich. And just so that you know, I took some chair prerogative and did some rewriting of some of the whereases that came over to us. And Gail has, they haven't been discussed by the committee. They haven't, they're my thoughts. That's all they are after listening to some of the testimony we heard the other day. So Michael has those now and he's kind of looking at them. Gail has also posted them. So they are on our website right now in case anybody wants to see. And remember, again, these are just my thoughts, in some cases for simplification and in some cases to elaborate on some of the issues. So with that, Rich, would you like to speak with us?
Thank you, Chair White, and members of the committee and everyone else in attendance here, colleagues, community members. I don't want to add anything in particular to what's already been stated to the House committee and by your previous witnesses and documents. I just want to be supportive. I want to affirm the actions of proposed by this bill, that they be carried forward. This has been a long time coming. It is, I see it as a first very serious step toward actually addressing the realities of relationship historically and in the contemporary community here. And more will come of it. I have not seen the proposed language changes that you've added, Chair White. I'll look at that when I have an opportunity. But I just want to be here in support at the moment and available if needed. So thank you for the time.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Rich? I will say that Rich has been very active and instrumental in some of the changes that have happened around the Brattleboro area. And sorry, Rich, I keep calling it Brattleboro, but
Wontostegok.
Yes. And as a result, we have some new markers down there that acknowledge the original names, and it's been quite impressive what Rich has been able to do in a, I will say, very quiet and deliberate way. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair White. I want to affirm that this is not my actions. This is on behalf of the community and the work of many, many, many people, both present and who are no longer with us. And you can go as far back as you'd like with that, because we are creating the future now and we have a great responsibility. So thank you.
Senator Ram.
Hi, Rich. It's nice to see you. I was just wondering, I believe you have experience with First Nations apologies as well from the Canadian government, or some sort of knowledge of that. I'm just curious, in your perspective, what constitutes a meaningful apology? You know, what elements do you feel like should be present for an apology to feel meaningful and like it lands?
That's a great question. I think it's been touched upon in previous testimony, and that is that that we need to move beyond words to actions. That acknowledgement is a first step. The government in Canada is having trouble with this. It's challenging because it's hard work to move beyond a single action and recognize the system that it resides within and how that's all connected, and how it's not simply an action taken in the past, but that it has effect today and into the future. And so it's a really big topic, but I think the essence of that is that words need to be followed by meaningful action, and within that recognition, it's really, really important that Native voices be forefronted, that direction and prioritization be informed by that community, because it's on those actions are on their behalf, and by extension, on everyone's behalf, because we are all here now and we need to figure this out. So make sure that you're including the appropriate parties and make sure that it's followed through. That's the essence there. And that's not easy. It's not easy at all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go to Susan. Susan, there you are.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair White and committee. I think this is my first time testifying before this committee, and so I would just like to give you a little bit of background. For the record, my name is Susan Aronoff. I am the Senior Planner and Policy Analyst for something called the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council. I don't think most of you know what the council is, so I'm just going to give you a little background on that. So all 50 states have a council. We were created under our Civil Rights Act, the DD Act, federal law, and we are entirely federally funded. In order to receive those federal funds, all the states and territories have to agree to certain assurances. And one of those assurances is basically to house and feed us. So we reside in the Agency of Human Services. I am a state employee. But another one of those assurances is that the Agency of Human Services has to include us in their quality efforts to improve services, of anything that impacts the lives of people with disabilities we're supposed to be in on. And the most important assurance that I just want to let you guys know about today is that the Agency of Human Services has to assure that they will not interfere with our advocacy efforts. And so because of that, I get to testify before you today as a state employee, and my opinions are those of the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council and not the Agency of Human Services. I just need to make that clear before I speak to every committee. Thank you for your indulgence in that. So what exactly does the federal government fund the Developmental Disabilities Council to do? We are funded, and our mission is to empower the voice of people with developmental disabilities and their family members, and make sure that their voice can, and so we are a council that is made up of majority of people with disabilities and their family members. And we are supposed to, we, the council staff, I'm a staff member, are supposed to work, we have a 5-year plan to assure that our council members and people with disabilities in general have access to influence all of the services and programs and activities that impact their lives. So where they live, work, learn, play, get their health care, get their education, any systems, special education rules, anything like that that's going to impact their lives. We work very hard to make sure that their voice is heard and can be, they can participate in that dialogue. And so normally at this point, I would turn this mic that I have, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify, over to one of our council members or someone with a disability or family member of someone with a disability so that they could share their lived experience. Because time was so short this session, I'm sad to state that so far I'm the only voice on the Senate side for the disability community. I'm proud to, happy that I have this job where I can be that voice. But I really think the voice of the people with disabilities needs to be heard. And so I sent you today, committee members, and maybe Gail can post it, a link to some of the testimony the House took from people from Green Mountain Self-Advocates, Max Barrows and Susan Ashcroft. Susan herself was a resident at the Brandon Training School. Max and Susan are both Vermonters with disabilities, and they're very active with the Green Mountain Self-Advocates. Our council works really closely with Green Mountain Self-Advocates, and I would encourage you to listen to their testimony. There was also testimony from the House from some of our council members, and I meant to send a link to that, and I will after this Zoom. I also share with you the council's platform and some information about that we sent out about just the lives of Vermonters with developmental disabilities. Perhaps the most important thing I shared with you, and this is really the through line to why this apology matters and why it matters a lot and why it matters a lot right now. The report I sent you is about the health disparities of Vermonters with disabilities, not just developmental disabilities, all disabilities. This was work done by our Department of Health that, in my humble opinion, has not received enough attention or airtime under the dome, virtual or otherwise. If you look at just the executive summary of that report on the health of Vermonters with disabilities, you will see that Vermonters with disabilities have rates of chronic conditions 2 or 3 times the rate of Vermonters without disabilities. And it's not because there's anything about having Down syndrome or autism that would lead to heart disease, diabetes, or cancer. It's because the same attitudes that led to eugenics are alive and well now. And we have seen that with COVID. We have seen the disparities with people of color, with Indigenous people, with poor people, with GLBT people. And our great health department, long before COVID, did work where they looked at the health disparities in Vermont through an equity lens. And they looked at the health disparities of Vermonters of color, LGBTQ Vermonters, low-income Vermonters, and Vermonters with disabilities. And I don't want to get into the competition of who's got it harder. I do want to say that Vermonters with disabilities are the largest group of people who experience health disparities in the state, and the health disparity issues that Vermonters with disabilities experience can be alleviated by just if people just follow the Americans with Disabilities Act sometimes and allowed just basic physical access to healthcare, communication access to healthcare, etc. So anyway, the reason why your passage, your work on this really matters to the council, why it's our #1 platform issue, is because Vermonters with developmental disabilities in particular were so impacted by Brandon and by the threat of Brandon. And we had amazing testimony in the House last session from one of our council members who, though she'd been coming to the State House for more than 25 years, was her first time testifying. And she talked about how she was encouraged to place her daughter at Brandon and how she worked very hard for the closing of Brandon. And I don't think I could overstate the importance of this issue and this apology to Vermonters with disabilities. The legislature did some great work over the years, cleaning up the language in the statutes, getting rid of the R word and things like that. If you have a chance to see Chair Stevens' House speech on why it's important the legislature own their actions and the impact, please do so. But this is a rare thing where the legislature is taking responsibility, accountability for its own actions. And it is super important. I want to echo what Rich said about what would make this apology more meaningful would be some follow-up actions. And we know that the House has a bill, a companion bill, it's not going to get out this session, to do just that, set up some kind of truth and reconciliation process so that the people who were impacted by this horrible chapter in our history can be heard, and we can figure out some way to address these ongoing injuries, including health disparities. H210, the health disparities bill, S16, the school exclusion bill or school equitable bill, all great ways to address some of these legacies, but these are the legacies. The school to prison pipeline for students of color, Indigenous students, students with disabilities, and the health disparities. That's the legacy of eugenics. That has to get stopped now. So I really encourage you to pass this. And please, please don't let the perfect, as they say, be the enemy of the good. I participated last year and this year in the discussions on the House. I think they worked in good faith and earnestly to come up with a really good statement, and time is short. So if you could get it out this session, would really be great. And I'm available to answer any questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I know your time is short.
Thank you, Susan. And our intention is to get it out with or without changes. We have some suggested changes, but and we even have suggested changes to the suggested changes. So I've just emailed Michael another thing that we talked about in committee the other day. I do want to say I did have the opportunity to see some of Max's testimony, and it was pretty riveting. I also want to say, and Senator Polina will remember this because I believe he was the prime sponsor of the bill that on respectful language. And Max was one of the people that worked really hard with us on developing that and getting it right. So I wanted to acknowledge Max for that work. Any questions for Susan? Yes, Senator Rahm.
Thanks, Susan. I was just wondering, health disparities can be kind of broad topic, and when I think of the impact of eugenics on people with disabilities, it is also kind of a weighty topic. I wonder if there are specific impacts that you think are important to call out, such as the impact on reproductive health for women with disabilities. What sort of stigmas do you think have built up, or who would you center in that conversation around health disparities for people with disabilities based on the legacy of eugenics?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I would say that women, particularly women of childbearing age, were particularly impacted, in the past. But I think that presently, one of the areas that the Green Mountain Self-Advocates have been really active in is trying to get age and language inclusive sexuality education information and informed consent information, things like that, into plain language. But there is still a strong presumption against people with disabilities being able to be parents. And the state is not as active now as it used to be when some of the institutions, Vermont State Hospitals, open. I will say I used to be a staff attorney for Disability Rights Vermont, now known as Vermont Protection. When I worked there, as Vermont Protection Advocacy. And one of the things that my clients experienced a lot then, and these were adults with psychiatric disabilities, not necessarily developmental disabilities, but they were also greatly impacted by eugenics. was if someone was pregnant or delivered a child while they were at the Waterbury State Hospital, that child was removed and presumed to be a child in need of care and supervision, and that parent was presumed not to be capable of being a parent. If someone had children and they voluntarily sought mental health care, whether in a state facility or just at, Brattleboro retreat, one of the constant chronic worries that exists today is if a parent admits to fear of self-harm, anything, there's a huge worry that a petition will be filed for some sort of state intervention and who's going to take care of their kids. And so a lot of parents, women in particular, do not seek or delay seeking treatment because they fear that the need of treatment will be used against them in parenting, whether by the state, by a spouse, by an ex-spouse, et cetera. So there's still a real stigma for people with disabilities in the area of parenting. I think there's also just a real stigma in the medical profession for people with disabilities, time and time again, whether it's someone with Down syndrome, someone who communicates through a facilitated communication device, or someone who just maybe has cerebral palsy and has difficulty speaking. The medical professionals talk to the person with them. That could be a direct support provider, that could be a parent or spouse, whatever. They don't talk to the patient, to the person. They assume that because they have some sort of communication challenge, that they have an intellectual challenge, that they're not able to understand or consent to their care and treatment. The basic access issues, and this we think is the through line of, do people with disabilities lives matter? Are services going to be available for people with disabilities? One of the things that we hear from parents and hear from people who use wheelchairs is basic access to something like getting weighed is still really difficult in Vermont. And there are parents who describe how they never had their kid weighed out of their wheelchair, even though weight gain for wheelchair users is really difficult. And that they were the recommendation was literally to go to the vet's office because they have floor mounted scales. They're just basic access. We have a council member who, because she uses a wheelchair and requires a Hoyer lift, a device in order to use the bathroom, she had to be catheterized to give a urine sample because her local medical clinic did not have a bathroom that was accessible for her to give a urine sample without undergoing the invasive and unnecessary medical procedure. So I really thank you for that question, because I think there are so many ways that the attitudes that led to eugenics that were kind of about whose lives were important and mattered and what's the value of a life of someone who has a physical or intellectual disability continue today.
Mm-hmm.
I really hate to say that, but the evidence is pretty clear.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer greatly. And it is a good reminder, particularly around parenting, that Vermont is highest per capita in its disruption of families and removal of children from the parent. And
if I may say one other thing about parenting, we had a really successful program in the state, and there's a woman involved in the one of the standing committees at Dale, Susan Yuan, who will talk very extensively about the success of this program that provided, where it was a Medicaid funded program that provided support to parents with disabilities to help them parent.
Thank you. Senator Polina?
I got it. I'm not really a question, but I appreciate the fact that you brought up Brandon Training School, because we talk a lot about the Waterbury State Hospital and whatnot. And I just wonder what the connections are with Brandon Training School in terms of time frames and what went on there. If you have anything to add, that'd be great. But we hadn't really heard much about the Brandon Training School in this conversation. So I appreciate you bringing it up.
So one of the things To know about the Brandon training schools, I'm not going to remember the exact name, but it was a really horrible name, feeble imbeciles and feeble-minded children,
Yeah.
something dreadful like that.
Yeah.
And it, you know, one of the things about all of these institutions, the Waterbury State Hospital included, Brandon Training School, is sometimes they were thought of as the mark of a kind and just society, a benevolent society. We're measured by how well do we take care of our least advantaged, most disadvantaged, as our governor likes to say, most vulnerable citizens, people who cannot provide for their own food, clothing, and shelter. And so states moved from progressive states, it was seen as a progressive thing to move away from underseers of the poor to these state-funded institutions where people could be guaranteed to have food, clothing, and shelter and have their other basic needs met. And these institutions weren't necessarily started as negative things. That's the thing about eugenics. It was like the hallmark of progressive social work at the time. It's crazy to think about now, but that's how far we've come. And so one of the things about Brandon, and one of the reasons why what we call consent to sterilization can be so murky, is that it was often a condition of leaving Brandon that people would be sterilized. And so think about that devil's bargain. Would you call that consent? You can have your freedom or you can have children, but you can't have both. And so people would quote unquote consent to be sterilized in order to be discharged or released from Brandon. And then we understand that some people were sterilized while they were at Brandon. Another thing related to Senator Ram's question, ways in which women were sometimes, and young women were sometimes disproportionately impacted by sterilization laws was as in their own protection, because they're likely to be exploited, so we don't want them to get pregnant. So they're likely to be assaulted, raped, whatever, but to make sure that there won't be offspring, they'll be sterilized for their own good or their family's own good, so they don't bear the expense or whatever of a child. And that is often how it was presented both to relatives, parents of minors and parents of adults. This is for this is in people's best interest.
Yeah, I'm going to take any more committee
I do.
member.
One last thing about Brandon, I do want to say, Vermont sometimes likes to say we were the first to close our state institution for the developmentally disabled, and we were not the first. We were probably within the top 5, but we can be very proud of the fact that we do not currently have an institution for people with developmental disabilities. We do send a number of children out of state to other states' institutions, and that's something we should be concerned about. But we do not currently have an institution in this state.
Senator Colomar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Susan, I just want to thank you for many of the points that you made. I was not in the committee the last time we took this resolution up, so I didn't hear a lot of the testimony, but I think it's so important, the point you made about how noble, at one time we thought many of these measures were. We had the General Assembly involved, we had the University of Vermont involved, we had state agencies involved, who all thought that they were doing the right thing. And it's only obviously looking back, we realize how awful it was. And I just wanted to thank you for making that point.
Any other committee comments, questions? We normally don't do this, but I did see that Rich, you wanted to make a comment, and I will let you, and then we'll go on to Carol.
I apologize.
That's
I just
okay.
wanted, I'm not sure if it's been mentioned previously, and I cannot offer any specifics, but we need to keep the Weeks School, Vermont Industrial School, in mind here as well.
And we did, I will say that we've had this conversation in the committee about whether we should try to name institutions and perhaps neglect some that should be named, or if we should just be more generic and talk about the state-sponsored institutions. So we will have that discussion as committee members of which direction to go, but know that we all know that there were and probably are still some state-sponsored institutions that need to be addressed. So with that, I'm going to go to Carol Irons, and I see that you do not have a snowstorm today, so you can make it to the committee. And I also want to comment on your beautiful cap that put you out of the picture for a little while.
Yeah, she really likes affection, so we're captive audiences at this point. We didn't get snow today, so hi everybody, I'm Carol McGranahan, and Carol Irons has joined me, so I'll give her the mic.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Chair White. Thank you for the committee people for listening to this. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I want to put the eugenics program in a little bit of a deeper context, because the way I look at it and the way most of the Abenaki people look at it is that it was more perhaps a peak experience, a culmination of a very long history, and it cast a very long shadow, and we still live with some of the residual attitudes that brought that whole program about. The Abenaki people do not have a migration story. We were here from the beginning times, and we don't talk about coming from somewhere else. We have creation stories, not migration stories. And yet, fairly recently, I think the latter part of the 20th century, someone heard a long migration story, put it in a book, and said this was the Abenaki origin story. It's actually the Mohawk people's migration story. This is an example of the kind of thing we live with even now. There's a lot of things in the books that were not put in there by our people because we weren't writing the books. And it creates a lot of misunderstanding that carries through how people look at us and what they think about the first people here in this landscape. Our people have an Algonquian language root. It's very ancient. There are many people on Turtle Island, on this continent, that come out of that, but not all people. The Algonquian language root has an old word that is Wabanaki. Waban is the word for first light or dawn, and Aki is the word for earth or land. So this is the dawn land, or the land of first light. This is the far northeastern part of this continent of Turtle Island. And that's why we have the name Abenaki as one of the groups of the Wabanaki people. When people came from across the Great Water, for the last 500 years, because we've been here for far more than 10,000 years, but in the last 500 years, we found ourselves overwhelmed with a people that came with a very different cultural framework, and that cultural perception influenced how they looked at the indigenous people they encountered here. It was a very different value system. It was a very different way of looking at things, and therefore of understanding the people who lived here. And we continue to live with that now. Many things have been written about us by people who looked at us out of their own cultural perspective. I can give you one example very quickly. When early settlers and the Jesuits that wrote Jesuit relations reports, that the early explorers that wrote reports, when they saw a family, a couple, a man and a woman, or maybe a small group, and they saw people moving along a trail, they saw that the men walked in front of the women. Out of their own cultural background, this gave them the interpretation that the men were superior, they were leading the way, the women were subservient and secondary in their culture. And that's the way they understood it. In the indigenous point of view, the women walked behind because the unborn offspring of the people was the future of the people. The only way you could protect when on the trail, when moving, the only way you could protect the future of your people was to have the man in front and the woman behind, and that unborn future, those who would come behind us later on, had to be in between in the woman's womb. So it was seen as an honoring and a respect for the life-bearing role of the woman in the culture. Totally misunderstood by people from another land that saw that as a sign of subservience, which of course in the colonial records, women were part of the property, just like the horses and the barn and whatever. That kind of cultural perspective, the value system that goes along with that, is what we're living with now. And it carried over to all our people, not just the women, but it was those kind of value systems that ended up with people thinking those who are indigenous are inferior and we need to keep them from breeding because we need to improve the breeding stock in Vermont by sterilizing them or taking away their children and civilizing them in foster homes or institutions. So this is the eugenics was just carrying to its logical conclusion some of those cultural differences, some of those value differences. We have that even now, and it's going to translate into whatever comes of an apology, because identity is so impacted by this. I mean, when I tried to find out about our heritage from my aunt, she said, oh no, she said, first they find out all about you, then they come for you. This was in the 1990s, and she was unwilling to share with us the specifics that she knew of what had happened when she was a young woman. She was an adult woman at the time in the 1930s, teaching school. But she wasn't going to tell us about our background for fear that shadow would again rear its head. Our needs now have to do with restoring enough of our cultural identity to help our children and those who come behind us to be able to know who they are in a good and positive way and not have to hide. I would urge this committee to be very careful who you listen to, because we've been here for more than 10,000 years, and yet we continue to have people define who we are and what we need according to how it will serve their agendas of being experts and making money off our people. It's a struggle we have even now. And it comes right out of the same stream of cultural values and attitudes that we've struggled with for the last 500 years. And I think the eugenics is just maybe a crack in the egg to kind of help bring out what's been going on undercurrent for a long time. So I really appreciate your being willing to hear about this and looking at it, and you need to look at who you listen to or who you don't. The earlier writings by those who were not part of the indigenous culture continued to say that we didn't live here, we only moved through. I was taught that in elementary school. No, the Indians didn't live here. They just traveled through. And this is something, that is still being said today by some people who feel they're speaking on behalf of the indigenous people and clarifying some of the historical research. I think if you read the book by Haviland and Powers, The Original Vermonters, there's archaeological evidence there that's useful to you. I think if you have time this summer, when, of course, you're supposed to be having a lot of free time, right? And I know your committees work right through the summer, as ours sometimes do. Another book that really might give you a more of a gut sense of what it was like when the two cultures met and clashed was written by Annie Proulx. It's a novel, Bark Skinners. But the devastation of the forests that occurred across this whole landscape changed even the ability to take care of ourselves as a forest people. And so even though it's a novel, it can kind of put a broader picture on what happened to the whole landscape and to an ability to take care of our people in our own way. We simply lost a lot of that. So we're trying to recover that. We appreciate very much your willingness to hear this and to consider stepping up to it and seeing what can be done now so that we can all move forward in a better way. So I thank you for your time and I'll answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you. I just a very small comment here. And when you said that, I don't remember if it was you or if it was Rich that said Waban was meant first light or dawn.
Yes.
I grew up right near an Ojibwe reservation in northern Minnesota, and there was a town right there called Waban. And it just, when you said that, it made me think, right, that was right there, and that was why they named it that. So anyway, any comments or questions? Thank you so much. That was great. And I don't think the committee has any intention of removing the Abnaki from the resolution. We haven't had the discussion about the exact language yet and what we intend to do with it, but I don't think that we have any intention of doing that, just to be clear.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Any questions or comments for Carol? And we're glad to see you made it today, and that there was no snow up there so you could make it. And you're one of those people that's going to get last mile broadband, I guess, at some point.
At some point.
Okay, I think we'll jump to Douglas Bent. Are you with us?
Yes, I'm here,
Okay.
Senator White. I'm not sure why my picture is not up, but
You may have your video turned off. Is there a little picture of a camera? Are you on a computer or?
yeah,
There might be a little picture of a camera up there that that has a red line through it. But if you can't find it, that's just fine. We can listen to you just as well. So
okay. Well,
thank you
thank
for
you.
being with us.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me today. Yeah, my name is Doug Bent. I'm from Braintree, Vermont, a member of the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs. I'm a spokesperson for the Kawasaka, the Coas tribe, director of the White Pine Association, which has the 501c3 for the Kawasaka tribe. And so I wanted to, Chief Shirley Hook wanted me to read this letter that she had found when she and her brothers and sister were going through their parents' belongings after they had passed away 3 years ago. This letter is from the Brandon State School and was sent to her grandfather. The letter is dated May 20th, 1932. And the children mentioned in the letter are his sister's 2 kids. And she lived in Chelsea, Vermont at the time. And Shirley's grandfather lived in Matawan, New Jersey, and was a policeman. And apparently they thought as a police officer, he might have some persuasion in getting the kids released. So I'll just read you this letter. It's from Truman J. Allen, MD, Superintendent, State of Vermont, Brandon State School. Dear Mr. Hook, answering your favor of the 17th reference to Delbert and Rosalba Ashley, would advise that there is little question in my mind, but that owing to mental retardation and limitation, we are all justified in recommending that they have the advantage, special study and training here so that we shall be able to define just what their condition may be and advise as to what seems best. A school like this affords an opportunity of careful individual study of such problem school children. The teacher reports that they are deficient in interest and that they don't grasp things quickly. Delbert is a masturbator, but this will probably cease after a while. Neither of the children are doing even first grade work. They are rather restless and lack in concentration. It would be inadvisable, of course, to think of moving them at this time, as they are now placed where they can receive the special attention that they need if we expect to help them. I am glad to report they seem to be in good health and are very happy here. They have not been at all homesick. I am glad to report anytime you wish to write. Very truly yours, Truman J. Allen. I think it probably goes without saying they never had children, those 2 children. And Chief Colin Wood wanted me to share this story with you as well about his family. They lived in Waterbury Center when he was growing up, and his mother worked at the Waterbury State Hospital in the 30s and 40s. And he was never told that he was Native until his father, was on his deathbed, pretty much ready to pass away. And they didn't want their 10 children to know that they were Native because they feared that they would be taken from them. And of course, the mother working at the hospital knew what was happening at that time. And so those are the 2 stories I'd wanted to share with you folks today about. And these are, very emotional stories for Colin and Shirley. And that's why I guess they wanted me to present him to you. We thank you for, listening to the testimony that everybody has to offer. And we hope that you do act upon this resolution and go forth with more meaningful, concrete things in the future. But we do appreciate this first step. I thank you.
Thank you. And please thank them for sharing their stories with us also. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, committee, what I'm going to suggest now is that we start actually looking at the language and figuring out where we want to go so that we can I doubt very much that we will finish this today. But we do need to finish it tomorrow. So tomorrow we're going to look at one other bill at 1 o'clock. And then whenever we're done with that, we'll continue this because we do need to get this passed. Our intention is to pass it this year and to make sure that it makes it over to the other body so that, and we have been in touch with the chair over there, Representative Stevens. So we're trying to keep him abreast of where we might be going here because we don't want to put up any roadblocks to this, but we want to, there are a few things we wanted to talk about and get right. So with that committee, I would ask, I guess let me ask here how you think is the best way to proceed with this. Michael, yes, Senator Colmar.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I noticed there was one other witness that hasn't testified. I don't know whether you had planned on calling on Judy or not.
Well, we heard from Judy last time
Okay.
and also from Carol, other Carol last time. And I want to make sure that we have time to have the committee discussion. And then what I'll do, I think, is as we start going through any language, is ask for comments from people about the actual language, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Judy, I didn't mean to shut you off, but we do need to get to the actual language here and what we might be doing. And we will ask people for their comments on the language. So I don't know, committee, if you have, Michael, have you done any magic for us, or should we work with the what I sent you?
At this point, again, for the record, Michael Chernick, Legislative Counsel, good afternoon. At this point, I've just been reading through what you have, a couple of places where there were some date typos that I've noted that need to be corrected, and also trying to figure out, to be certain, where you wanted me to eliminate clauses. I think I have it correct. I haven't had a chance yet because I've been focusing on listening to the testimony to actually sit down and type, other than the couple of emails that I sent you for clarification points and questions. So as you go through each, I would also appreciate your going through what the House passed and confirming for me, for example, in certain cases, that indeed you do want to strike a clause entirely as opposed to modifying it, so that I know that I have it correctly.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to go on our committee website. And
I do have the email from you, so.
Huh?
I do have the email, Madam Chair.
Right.
You sent me with the language, and I'm just comparing it against the House version. And there are a couple of places where I think you've stricken a clause, but I just wanted to make sure that's what you intended to do.
Yep. So Gail, did you post what I sent, the email I sent you? I don't see it there.
Yes, I did, Madam Chair.
Yeah,
if you refresh your screen, it's under your name.
Okay, there it is. Okay. So let's just because it's here, can we start with this possible language, committee?
Sure. I think that's a good next step, is to look at your work versus what the House sent us.
Well, some of it is exactly the same, and some of it I just thought needed clarification. And so the first one I wrote was, whereas since 1906, laws, policies, and procedures have been enacted to promote the eugenics movement, and possibly just taking off then with the motto, breed better men. But I wanted to, after we heard the testimony, wanted to make it clear that this didn't start in 1922 or 1912. It was a movement before that. So that was my intent there. Yes, Senator Colmar.
I fully support leaving that clause in precisely for the reasons that Susan mentioned.
Okay.
That, yeah, I think it's very, very good idea to leave that breed situation in there.
Leave the whole thing in about breed
Yes.
better men.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Any other committee members have any comment on that? Just that statement?
Senator White, if I may ask, could I have the source of where that phrase came from?
It was we heard it from testimony that was kind of the, I think Judy was the one that, talked about the motto that had been given. I don't know where it came from. If it was just kind of generally known that was Judy, do you know where that actually came from? Or was it just kind of the motto of the eugenics movement?
It was the motto. It's in lots of sources. I can't just give you one right now.
Okay.
But I could look up for one if you would like and let you know.
Yeah, I don't know that we need to have a
And
source.
ideally, we would like to be able to fact check it in the ideal.
Tanya,
Okay.
Tanya, I think was it in some of Tanya's material?
It's a common phrase.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it was in Tanya's material, but it may have
Is it
been.
in Nancy Gallagher's book, or?
No.
If you could, if Judy, if you can just find one source where it's, so that Michael feels he needs to be very truthful about what we put in here, and I respect that a lot. So if you can just come up with one source, and I'll also send a note to Tanya and ask her.
I'm confused. Why are you asking to be truthful about this and not about the fact that the word Abenaki is not in the records?
I'm asking us to be truthful about what we're writing.
That's what I'm talking about. The word Abenaki is not in the eugenics records, but you said you will not take it out.
Right.
So I'm confused by that. Do you want to justify one but not the other?
I think that what we have heard from other people, including our archivist and other people who have looked at the record, that the records are not complete, and that a source that, our pro tem did a lot of research as I believe it was her master's thesis on this issue, and she found that the records are not totally complete, and that the Abenaki, in fact, should be mentioned in here.
No, the records are complete. The one box that's missing is Perkins' personal letters.
Okay, well, I don't know that we're going to argue about this. I think our committee feels strongly that this should be left in, and we've heard from a number of people that it needs to be left in. We heard from Carol, Rich today, Doug, and we've heard from other people also that
right.
it
But
is
the House heard from 4 historians and they all said it's not in the records.
well, but they put it in, so they did have Abenaki in there in their resolution.
Right.
House did.
Right. I understand that.
Okay, I don't want to get into an argument here about this. I believe that, can I ask the committee members if we have any intention of removing the word Abenaki or leaving it in? Senator Clarkson.
My understanding, Judy, is that we're trying to be inclusive of all the bands and of what all may be under the umbrella of Abenaki, and that was as inclusive a term as the other groups that are identified. And so our understanding is that this includes, and Vermont recognizes the Abenaki, and that it is an umbrella for many of the bands that were included in the eugenics movement.
You're not being inclusive, though. That's the point I'm trying to make. If you go back to the original recognition bill, it says we recognize there's 1,700 Indigenous people living in this state. And to recognize the Abenaki excludes the others who are in those records. That's the point I've been trying to make.
So we did say we do have mixed ethnicity and Indigenous
Right.
Yeah,
But the indigenous people who are listed in the records are listed as mixed ethnicities.
okay, I'm going to take us off this topic and go to the second point here. But I want to ask if people are comfortable with the first one, and I will get some reference from Tanya Marshall for Michael.
Okay, I just found it in Scientific American. There's an editorial called "The Breeding of Better Men," but
Okay,
it is a kind of common phrase used in articles of that day. So I don't know.
can you send that to Michael?
Mhm.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to move to the second comment here that we had. And whereas the movement targeted for elimination delinquent, defective, and dependent people, that should just be dependent. And one of the specific laws enacted at the federal level, which was the Marriage Restriction Law of 1929, that, and I couldn't remember, it restricted mixed ethnic marriages, but I couldn't remember if it did anything else. Does anybody remember? Because I just put that. I think that it restricted people from, it was quite complicated actually. It restricted people from getting married and having marriage licenses, and yet marriage licenses were used to prove who you were. And so if we want to put that in, we should have a short explanation of what it was. If we don't want to put it in, that's fine. Committee?
Let's keep it and let's find the source.
Well, I don't, it isn't the source that I'm worried about. It is just like a one sentence explanation of what it did.
Right.
And I looked it up and I couldn't find anything specific about it. I could only find about interracial marriages. So, okay, we'll work on that one a little more.
You could also just end it after 1929. You could just say,
okay,
one of the specific laws enacted at the federal level was the Marriage Restriction Law of 1929.
Yeah, could do that.
That marriage was restricted somehow.
So, and then I have in 1922, the Vermont General Assembly passed S-79, an act to authorize and provide for the sterilization of imbeciles, feeble-minded, and insane persons, rapists, confirmed criminals, and other defectives, which was vetoed for fear of its unconstitutionality. And Michael had that in his thing, but I found it a little bit hard to follow because of the way it was written. And he also tells me it's 1912, not 1922. Committee?
Do we want to make reference which governor vetoed it?
I don't care if we do or not.
Okay.
That's up to you whether you want to put it in.
More real. If it's
Okay. Okay. Michael, can you do that?
You're muted.
And I don't remember which governor it was offhand, but Meade.
Yeah.
No, Weeks.
Weeks, I thought it was, yeah.
And was he the same one of the Weeks School?
Weeks School is named,
Yeah.
Madam Chair, it's named after him, yes.
Yeah, great. He was afraid that this would be unconstitutional, and then he founded the Weeks School. Good guy. Okay, sorry about that. All right, but are we okay with that?
Yes.
I think so.
Yes.
Just to go back to the restricted marriage 1929. Actually, all it alludes to is Child Marriage Restraint Act, unless somebody can point me to something more than restraints around marrying children. It doesn't, in fact, say, as far as I can find, that it has anything more than restricting marriage between a minor and an adult.
Well, I looked up Marriage Restriction Act of 1929, and it said that it was one of the laws that was enacted to restrict interracial marriage. And I think that we heard from Judy that it was more restrictive than just interracial. It was any mixed marriages of any sort, and I think she also alluded to the fact that it restricted marriages between mentally ill people or people who were considered defective. Am I right about that, Judy?
Yes. Up until 1950, it was illegal to marry a Native American, but legal to marry an African American or someone of Asian descent.
And did it also have some restrictions around marrying the people that they considered at that point defective or delinquent or dependent?
Yes. And the fact that being defective, dependent, and delinquent was subjective,
Yeah.
then it becomes problematic.
Right.
So marriages were prevented simply because they subjectively determined someone as defective or dependent or delinquent.
Right. That's what I remember you saying. That's why I put it in there. But we'll get the exact language for that. All right. And then here's the question that we need to address the committee. Whereas state agencies and institutions adopted policies and procedures to carry out the intent of the legislation and the benefits and the beliefs of the eugenics movement. I think that the question is, do we name state agencies and hope that we get them all? Or do we just be more generic and refer to state agencies and institutions? And I ask that because I think that Rich brought up the question of, we mentioned in the House version, it mentions the Brandon School, but it never mentions the Weeks School. And so I fear that if we try to name them, we will inevitably leave some out. And so my suggestion was that we just be more generic and say that the state institutions and the state agencies did what we told them to do. They set up their policies and procedures to carry out our legislative intent.
I think you might say some or several state. I don't think you need to make it all state agencies.
Okay.
Like including?
Well, no, but if you include them, then you have to mention them.
Right. If you include them, you have to say who they are. Yeah, Keisha?
I think that the intent, I think I raised this concern, and my intent in raising this concern is to highlight that some of those past institutions still make up our human services, education, and, other kind of administrative services. And that to me ties into the later statement that we have to continue to eradicate the legacy of eugenics. So for me, it was more just to try and nod to institutions that frankly still exist, that are supposed to serve children and families, but carry this legacy with them when they do that.
My concern with that is I don't know how we start naming them, because
I wasn't saying to name them. I was trying to sort of say like they were agencies that kind of maintained these. They were the ones that served children and families that we have to kind of, I don't know. Let me think for a second. But it was trying not to do a laundry list, which I get, but say that, these institutions live on with the legacy, and they serve children and families, and they sort of still have the shadow of this legacy.
Well, I think I've tried to say that farther on.
I think in her last her last one, we could.
And I've changed the last one again.
What, the last one that we're gonna build on, remember?
Yeah,
Because we're trying to actually eradicate that legacy. But where you had just, and I don't know how you redrafted it, but you had, whereas the legacy of the eugenics movement
Yep.
continues to influence, and you could there, Keisha.
yeah, I've rewritten that, but I want to stay, go through these so that we don't.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to jump there. I just feel like if you just say some state agencies, I don't think it has as much descriptive power for referencing later on as saying certain state agencies and institutions that were designed to serve children and families, or were human services and, you know.
Oh, my guess is it was more than just ones that were designed to serve children and families. My guess is that it was probably our prison system. It was probably our our healthcare system that wasn't specifically designed to serve children and families. It was probably our zoning.
Yeah,
I
maybe
mean,
if it
everything.
said institutions that carried out social health and planning policy or something. I don't know what value it has to just say some institutions.
It doesn't say that. It
says
whereas state agencies and institutions adopted policies and procedures to carry out the intent of the legislation and the beliefs of the eugenics movement.
Okay.
And I think if we tried to limit it to those that were what we consider kind of the social service agencies, that we're not really getting at it, because I suspect that there were, I don't know what agencies existed then, but I'm sure that there were agencies that had nothing to do with social service goals, and they carried out the same.
I actually think keeping it this way, I actually would support this and the additional beef up of your last one of your.
Okay, so let's leave it. State agencies and institutions adopted policies, and then the next one, which
Madam
says,
Chair,
yes.
when you were doing, because when I seemed to be off from it, I was doing some quick research. You were referring to the Child Marriage Restriction Act of 1929. And the one, maybe you found another reference than I did, but I've looked both through our indexes and online, and the only Child Marriage Restriction Act of 1929 specifically that I found is in India.
Yes, I found that also.
Okay.
And I raised this as it's only to do with building. So maybe another one.
I'm going to ask, not this moment, but I'm going to ask Judy and Tanya to, if they have more specific information about that. And not right at this moment, but to get it to us.
I
Does
just
that make
wanted to
sense?
alert you to that because I was concerned.
Yep. No, thank you. And okay, so whereas in 1925,
We'll leave that as it is.
I suggested just leaving that as it is in the, and the print on this is so small that that's the one that talks about
Perkins.
Henry Perkins.
Yeah.
Okay. And then whereas state sanctioned policies targeted the poor, mentally ill and disabled and persons of mixed ethnicity. And then, so I separated these two things so that one talks about targeting the poor, mentally ill and disabled persons of mixed ethnicity. And then the other ones talks about state sanctioned policies, particularly targeted individuals and families who were French Canadian, Native American, Indian heritage, French Indian, and Abenaki. And the only thing I did there was add French Canadian. But I separated those two so that it was clear that individuals, but in this case, whole families were targeted. And we could say individuals, families, and communities to make it even clearer that the whole community was targeted.
Yep.
So I'm trying to I'm just trying to weigh Judy's
Yeah.
concern about being fair to the record. I don't know if she would disagree with me, so we could see, but what I understand from what she's saying, but she may disagree, is that that's just not the way people were identified at the time. But now one might look back and say that those were Abenaki families. And is there a way to articulate that they would be presently considered Abenaki, even if they weren't identified that way in the record? I don't want to overcomplicate things, but Judy, am I understanding that correctly? I mean, one would say that if you looked back at history, those were Abenaki families that were impacted. They just wouldn't have been identified personally or in the records that way.
No, just the reverse.
Okay.
So in the records, there were, out of 202 families, there were 5 that were mentioned as mixed racial: colored, Black, Negro, possibly Indian, and French Canadian. And so that's the point that I've been trying to make. Everybody was listed except French Canadians as mixed racial ethnicities. So you could simplify it by saying French Canadian and other mixed ethnicities, because everybody was listed as a mixed ethnicity.
Yeah,
I wrote down some examples because I got an invitation to appear, and I thought the invitation was to appear to speak, but clearly not. And so I put together some of the language so you could see how subjective it was, that how people were described, because they were all described in a generic mixed racial identity, except those that were French Canadian. There was a sincere hatred for French Canadians.
So what if we did something like state-sanctioned policies particularly targeted individuals and families and communities who were French Canadian and other mixed, whatever the word was you used, mixed racial ethnicity or mixed ethnicity, and then put now seen as Native American, Indian heritage, French Indian, and Abenaki, so that it's clear that although they weren't identified that way, that's who they were talking about.
No, it is not. That's what I've been trying to tell you. When they write their letters to track down the history of their families, they're writing to Mohawk reservations. They're not writing to Abenaki reservations. All the letters are to Mohawk reservations, Akwesasne, Ganawage. And so that's why if you put Abenaki in there, you're slapping the people in the face who are here, those mixed groups that were identified.
But Judy, Abenaki didn't have reservations. So
Right.
they would have been asking those other tribal groups who then said, no, those are not our people, right?
No, they never got an answer back from anybody.
Right, but they didn't have a reservation. Rich, could you weigh in here?
And Carol.
Yeah. And Carol, yeah.
I don't feel as qualified to speak to this, to the specificities of the questions about how people are named. I would add an observation that the state of Vermont was not recognizing Indigenous people all along. They were written out of the record. It's a process of erasure. But I can't speak to specificities. And so why would the concept of a people indigenous to the state be introduced at that point when they had been specifically eliminated verbally and legally up till then? But that's all I can say to that.
The reason is because they're appearing on death certificates and birth certificates as Indian or French Indian or Mohawk or from Akwesasne or from Ganawage. And I don't know where you got that there was no reservations, because I have stacks and stacks of letters to those reservations.
To Abenaki reservations?
No, to Mohawk reservation.
Right.
That's what I wasn't saying that.
Well, there was an Abenaki reservation. Of course there was. Odanak and Willanack.
Well, Odanak was Canadian at the time, wasn't it?
So was Ganawagi, and they were writing to that.
So what did the letters for Odanak say?
There
You're saying there were no
wasn't any.
letters?
There was none. Zero.
Okay, I want to hear from Carol.
To my point.
Yes, thank you. I think there seems to be a bit of confusion. I agree with Rich that we were never recognized. I mean, how could Ethan Allen get Vermont recognized if he admitted that there were actually Indigenous people native to Vermont? I don't know how many. Vermont did not have any Abenaki reservations. We were not able to claim a plot of land as our own. The perpetual myth that the Allens promoted about, nope, they just moved through. It sounds like that myth is perpetuated by others. And census reports themselves never even broke out the categories between Black and white. You were either Black or you were white. If you weren't Black, then they put you in under the white category. So again, it's like Rich was mentioning, that documentation or lack thereof erases a people. The admission that you're actually existing erases you. If you don't admit we're not, I'm sorry, I get a little emotional, but the Abenaki, there's archaeological studies, there's field digs, there's evidence that we've been here for thousands of years. So to disappear suddenly in 1600 and then come back in the 1900s, I don't think is really reality.
I'm going to ask Michael if he has a suggestion for how to word this in a way that, because I personally think it's important to acknowledge the three categories there: the Native American Indian, the French Indian, and the Abenaki. And I think it's important to recognize that. And if they weren't, if the state sanctions at the time just targeted French Canadian and mixed ethnicity families and individuals and communities, then I think we need to find a way to put that we now know that those mixed ethnicity populations were actually Native American Indians, French Indians, and Abenaki.
Yeah,
Let me,
I agree. I think that
let
is
me,
a good way to figure it out.
being very cautious of not trying to make a policy judgment for the committee. But how would it be if you did French Canadian, which everybody seems to agree on, French Canadian, if you want to say French Indian, mixed heritage, other mixed native, if you went French Canadian, Native American Indian or Native American heritage without specifying a specific band or tribe, French Indian and other mixed heritage, thereby recognizing Native American, but not saying whether it's Mohawk or Algonquin or Abenaki. Just
Exactly.
You will make, am I on? You will make a lot of the Abenaki community very upset, because we all know that we're Abenaki and we knew it then, but we had to hide so as not to have our children taken away or be sterilized. So if we didn't put it in the record that we were Abenaki, most of us put in our birth records that we were white. Our parents did. And this was part of what the eugenics was all about, was
Right.
hiding our identity, but it doesn't mean the identity isn't there.
Okay.
Carol, I don't think you
alter-
understand.
I think,
The largest family, 623 people who were sterilized in the eugenics records. And my family was one of the 5 identified as Indian.
well, I'm going to say here that I personally, and I want to hear from the rest of the committee, I personally think it is important to leave the term Abenaki in.
I agree. In some capacity, and we need to find the right way to do it, but
Yes. And I will, and so I want to hear from the rest of the committee. Senator Collmore,
I agree.
Senator Ram.
Well, first, I just want to say, in the midst of all of that, you know, Judy said something that's really hard to say in public, which is that your family was deeply affected by this. And I understand that that's, you know, a big part of, a huge part of why you want to get this right. Judy, you've sent me pieces before about how Iroquois tried to make land claims in Vermont, how other federally recognized tribes have tried to claim part of this as their territory. And it is Abenaki territory. These are the original inhabitants of the land. So, you know, if people who were identified as French Indian, mixed ethnicity, you know, likely had indigenous blood, were, you know, included in those sterilized, then to me, that would still say that in present day, we would identify those people as Abenaki. So I'm still missing the concern that you're trying to express, Judy, in that it doesn't seem like there's another tribe that would supersede them in that we should name.
I know finding the right word has been difficult, but if you use the term French Indian, you're describing every family in the records identified as Indian.
But people might want to have a different, people in those records who were French Indian might want to identify differently now. And they might want that to be righted in some way, that they were Abenaki, and maybe their ancestors didn't want to say that, but they do now.
Exactly. And some of them identify as Mohawk.
So could we say Abenaki and Mohawk?
No, that's why you've got to get, you know, there could be other groups too, but you've got to be able to say it generically. And what Mr. Chernick said was exactly right. He had it exactly right.
But I guess I would say, you know, I know the chair wants to move along, and Judy, with deep respect for you, I have to listen to other people who want to be identified as the First Nations people of Vermont and be recognized.
I understand that, but today we still have Mohegan recognized as living in this state. When you look at the maps of territory, the whole Rutland area is Mohegan. This is not a state of entire Abenaki people.
So maybe we could say including Abenaki people, because those are the people who've really come forward to seek this apology, who are our First Nations people.
We could do that. And so have Michael's language and then say including Abenaki.
I don't know why. I'm confused by why you're paying attention to such historical details, but you're not paying attention to the fact that in these records are identified as French Indian. That does not mean they're Abenaki.
I think that I think that Carol's statement was very compelling when she said that they were, but they didn't refuse to identify themselves because they were afraid that they would be targeted. So
nobody did.
Well, I know, but so we could list all the bands and all the everybody who
I think also this resolution is speaking to the living. It's speaking to the people who now identify as Abenaki. It is speaking to the living. It's not, we're trying to move forward. And so I think you want to stay current with how people identify now, as opposed to how they were forced to identify 75, 80, 90 years ago.
Senator Polina?
Well, I also think that the resolution is speaking to other Vermonters who are not Native Americans. And Vermonters reading this, they relate to our Native people as Abenaki, whether we like it or not. I mean, that's what people recognize. And I think that it only makes sense to, if you want Vermonters to be sympathetic and supportive of the resolution, to use language that they can relate to. And Abenaki is the word that Vermonters relate to when they think about their Native people.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
Yep, I think that's good too.
Well, I'm going to ask Michael to come up with his magic language.
There's one other thought I had, but I, again, could be off base, which is, Judy, if I'm correct, and again, I could be absolutely wrong, but the groups that might have some claim or some, heritage on the land that is now Vermont are all part of the Wabanaki Confederacy. Isn't that right? The Mohegan, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy. So
No, they're not.
okay, so which confederacies?
I have an employee that sits across from me every day who's Mohawk, who's in the record. Every day I sit across her, and she keeps talking to me like, why is this a problem? Why can't they understand there were others here?
So then what confederacy are the Mohawk a part of?
Iroquois.
So you sent me a Life article that said we rejected an Iroquois land claim in Vermont because they were not the First Nations people on this side of Lake Champlain.
I didn't send you that.
You sent me a Life magazine article about the Iroquois land claim of 1960.
So Jim Peterson explored the possibility of Missisquoi as an Iroquoian settlement.
And it was rejected.
Was it that the article?
Yeah, well, it was a Life magazine piece about Vermont being subsumed into the Iroquois Confederacy and how that was fought. And what I recall is that was important, that this be recognized as the Wabanaki Confederacy's first
It's
land.
not though. Mohegan are alive and part of the corner of the state. If you look at the maps, they have a tribal historian in an office in Williams, Massachusetts, that takes the remains that are found archaeologically, and they were moved, became the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of the Mohegan, but they still occupy that land as the, and I keep going back to recognition. The recognition bill says we recognize there's at least 1,700 Indigenous people living in the state. And the reason they did that is because they didn't identify them all as the Abenaki.
So I think that Senator Polina had a really good point here, and that if we have this language and we say including Abenaki, that it acknowledges that there are others, but it includes them, and it also speaks to there's a lot of people out there who are going to be paying attention to this and reading this. And not only out there, but there are 30 senators that we have to have vote on this. And if my belief is that if we leave out the term Abenaki, that it will be questioned about why we did, because that is how most Vermonters view the First Nation people. I think Senator Polina's point was well taken, and I'm going to move on, and I'm going to ask Michael to work his magic and come up with some language here that we can look at tomorrow, and that I think that you had a good start, and then if you say including Abenaki. Rich?
If I could make one more comment,
Sure.
or I have a question for Judy. I'm trying to understand where you're coming from, and I think I do. I understand that the word Abenaki is not mentioned in the documents for which the apology proposes to address. I get that. You just stated that your family, and I'm sorry for this news and this reality, was implicated deeply in this process. But you identify as French Indian and you identify as Abenaki. I'm trying to reconcile that.
As I am with you, Rich, what do you identify as your tribal ancestry?
Mi'kmaq.
There you go. That's my point. There are other people in this state from other tribes that are not Abenaki. That's my point exactly.
Understood. I think we should include everyone who was targeted for this.
So do I.
We should also recognize and admit at this point in time that those people are called Abenaki for the most part.
I'm not sure I agree with that. There are a lot of people in this state that do not self-identify as Abenaki, who are Abenaki.
But there are people who self-identify as Abenaki, and both are named.
I'm actually going to we can have more of this conversation tomorrow when we see and I hope you all join us tomorrow when we see Michael's magic terms for us, but I'm going to ask us to move on now with the resolution, and when Michael comes up with his magic language, I hope you all are with us and we can talk about it then. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so whereas in 1927, whatever that one is, I suggested leaving all the rest of them as they are until the very last one. And what I wrote is, and the legacy of the eugenics movement continues to influence some of our current policies. I would take out even some of our current policies and legislation, and we will continue to work to eradicate the legacy of the actions by listening to and working with the affected communities. That was my suggestion.
I like that.
I think that's a good suggestion.
I mean, I didn't have that in there by listening to and working with the affected communities necessarily until Rich said that that was really important in going forward.
Oh, I think it's
Madam Chair.
Yep.
Madam Chair, if I may, on that last clause, would you consider taking that last piece that you sent me in the second email as a second resolve?
That makes sense.
It just might make it for a very, if you put the two of them together, it's looking to be a very long resolve clause.
Sure.
And just splitting it down the middle, keeping it all, but splitting it.
Yep.
And then if you don't like it tomorrow, you can change it again, obviously.
Okay, no, that sounds good. So committee, do we have some general agreement about where we're going in some of the language here? And I think the only unresolved issue is how we
phrase it.
Have the language in that second one about targeting families, individuals, and communities.
And the marriage restriction.
Yeah.
Clean up. I mean,
and we can I'll look at that. I'll ask Tanya for some language. And if we can't, I mean, we can take that out. It wasn't in the original one. It was another indicator that there
Yeah.
were policies and laws that were continuing to work in that direction and eradicate people. But other than that, are we anywhere near?
Yeah.
And I will also send
Yep.
this to Tom Stevens. Yes,
If they're still on the floor, I
Yeah.
think.
but I'll send it to him, and he did comment. I read the committee, his comments. He was okay with all of them. He was okay with the 1906 one, but he said it had nothing to do with our apology, but I thought it helped lay the groundwork that this was happening before we ever did the eugenics survey.
Great.
Keisha?
I just want to say, for any of the folks from tribal communities who are on, or anybody listening, if there are Mohican folks, or others who just want to be heard in this process, I'd be happy to listen. I know we're on a short timeline. I know that people don't follow every state legislature's Indigenous and Indian Affairs legislation, but it's been out there for all session. We've had this conversation over many years, and I personally have not had outreach from people from other federally recognized tribes who've asked for this apology to be included. If I'm wrong about that and others have wanted to be heard, I think, it's appropriate to try and have communication from them. But I would just say we have been doing this for a long time, and we haven't had any federally recognized tribes communicate to us that I'm aware of.
I have not heard from anyone. I don't know if other committee members have.
No.
Nope.
All right. So committee,
Thank you. I
and
think
I have to say, I really appreciate Carol and Judy and Rich and Brent, Doug and everybody who's talked to us and been very forthcoming, because these are hard conversations. And I think we all acknowledge and Susan, I think we all acknowledge the hurt that was perpetrated and that continues. And so I really appreciate your willingness to talk with us. And I think the entire committee feels that way.
Yes.
Yep. Thank you.
Michael?
Madam Chair, if I may keep you for just one more second, I've been scribbling. And
Yep.
I was just wondering, so I don't go down on the wrong path tonight. Just specifically, how would it sound if I wrote mixed Native American tribes, multiple Native American tribes and bands, including the Abenaki, as a compromise?
Why don't we look at it, Michael, and why don't you send that to all of us and let's look at it and
But offhand, it sounds good.
Yeah.
And can, we'll say, if you can send that to Gail also, then she can also send it to Carol and Judy and Rich and Susan and Doug and whoever.
I'll send that, my thoughts on that clause to all of you in an email. I'll send it to Senator White and to Gail, and then all of you can distribute it further
Okay, great.
and can send me feedback.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. This is a hard issue, and I appreciate everybody's willingness to participate in it, and just know that when there are disagreements, they are not personal at all. We are just trying to get it right for most people. I think that's it's a hard topic to wrap our heads around, and and knowing that we still are in many ways suffering the legacy of that whole movement and our complicity in it. So,
If I may, Madam Chair. Oh.
yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say, I mean, self-identification is such a challenging thing. People with disabilities were not called people with disabilities at the time in the records. They were called very terrible things that I don't think came from their self-determination. And, you know, people might have different feelings at this point about the names that feel most relevant to their self-identification. And we have to try and honor that while recognizing that this is a living process, and that, you know, descendants and human beings and people who are impacted are involved who just have different ways of identifying. And, you know, most people didn't get to be part of how they were identified in the record. And I think that's just an important thing to weigh in this conversation.
Thank you. Judy, did you?
Yes, and when you're fine tuning those words, and you have brought, also known as today, the Abenaki to the future, nothing else has been brought to the future. And as I said in the House, and I said to you folks, this is continuing today, that everything is past tense in this thing. There's nothing that talks about what's happening today. And it's all around us.
I think that's our chair's last whereas or first resolve. I think that's the language that Jeanette was trying to get at, is that we understand and we are committing with this resolution to heighten our awareness, and we're resolving to do better and go forward, not continuing to
So you're not acknowledging the programs in the 60s and the programs in the 80s and 90s. You're not acknowledging any of that. You're just going to do better.
Well, I think that I don't know if we start recognizing programs. There are programs, and then there are policies, and there are, I mean, even for example, the language that we had in our statutes that we changed. We had a bill not long ago that changed what we call the respectful language bill, because it talked about imbeciles and the feeble-minded, and our language was there, and so we tried to make corrections around that. So I don't know that where we would draw the line as to what the legacy is. And I'm trying to think of that there certainly were very specific things that resulted from this legacy, but there are probably things that are not specific. They weren't programs, they weren't acts, but they influence our thinking. And I think that Susan alluded to some of those, just the way people treat people with a disability. If you're in a wheelchair, does the medical guy talk to you, or does he talk to the person that's with you? And so I think that if we started talking about specific things that happened in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and probably in the 2000s, we would have a list that went on forever, and we wouldn't get at those kind of underlying nuances that still infect the thinking that many of us have. And I hope our goal is to be able to, when we're looking at issues and legislation and policies and procedures, that this is becomes part of our thinking, and how we address those things and how we think about them. So that's my reason for not trying to specify things that continue to happen. Rich?
I think to Judy's point about continuing effects and side effects that are post eugenics survey and through the present. To that point, the House version of this bill and the chair's last whereas, which mentions continuing to influence, the House final statement, final resolve statement, definitely creates that allowance and that inclusion where it says that the General Assembly recognizes that further legislative action should be taken to address the continuing impact of state-sanctioned eugenics policies and related practices of disenfranchisement, ethnocide, and genocide. It's all in there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And we left
right
that.
up till now.
Yeah, we left that there.
Yeah. To Judy's point, this is continuing. It's systemic, and it all needs to be tackled one step at a time.
And this is an important piece of awareness for, I mean, for many people who couldn't tell you about this movement and this survey, to, you know, who aren't necessarily even aware of it.
Susan? Oh, you were.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that Ann Donahue had added some language to the Health Equity Bill, H210, when it was still in House Healthcare Committee, to try to bring the through line forward that you're talking about. And she had like a whereas kind of a findings clause, and I will look for it and send it to you and Michael. I tried to make the suggestion in the House, but I think General Affairs Committee, but I think was a little late, that you just add something saying that the health disparities experienced that we see today by BIPOC and people with disabilities are the direct result, or, you know, flow from these eugenics policies and practices. I mean, there's a really, you know, Michael might ask me for a source for that, and I apologize, but I mean, there just really are some obvious through lines to the conditions that people find themselves in today and the eugenics movement of the past.
We will look at that tomorrow. I am a little reluctant to put something so specific in there because there are also economic disparities that are clearly linked to this, and land ownership disparities and all kinds of things that, so
Yeah.
I would hate to put in something that just addresses health disparities when we know that it has impacted housing disparities. So
yeah, that's fair. And it would make sense that it could go the other way, where the health disparities bill could say this flows from eugenics, but you're right, eugenics has flowed into so many other disparities that to name health would leave out the others. I totally get that.
Your current example of a mental health patient at the Brattleboro retreat who's having a child, and the concerns about being able to keep that child are very present and very 2021.
Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you all so much, and thank you for sticking with us on this long afternoon. This is an important topic, and I can't tell you exactly what time tomorrow. I don't know if you have any ability to be flexible, but it will be sometime after 1:30. I can guarantee you that, because I think our other issue will take us at least half an hour. So for those of you who can join us, Gail will send you an invite and you can stand by, and we'll see you whenever we can see you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I know it doesn't make any sense at all, but
No,
did you get the idea?
Sense given our life.
I don't know if this will help Mr. Chernick, but here's the book that lists the laws for Vermont. and who you can marry, about the marriage law, who you can marry and who you can't.
I thought we were referring, no, then I need a little clarification if I may. I thought that everyone was referring to a federal law, which is what I was looking at, not a
That's
state
what I
law.
wrote.
And because Senator White wrote a federal law, if you want me to be referring to Vermont law on marriage restrictions, that's easy enough for me to do.
Oh,
So I just need some clarity on that because Judy's saying one thing and Senator White's saying something totally.
no, that
different.
was my fault. I thought it was a federal law, but you're saying it was the state law. Okay, great. That
Fine, I
solves
can
the whole thing.
find-
Thank you.
I
That
can
was my
find
fault.
That's easy for me to find. I have those references right here.
Okay,
And
great.
I know it went on, this book was written in 1950. So I know it went on quite a while.
Now,
Yeah.
if I may ask one more question, if I may, this was a marriage restriction with respect to race or with respect to ethnicity or respect to children and adults?
Well, it talks mostly about,
I know there are age restrictions.
yeah, but it talks mostly like Ms. White said about the subjectivity that was introduced to specific people as to whether they were dependent, defected, or delinquent. And that subjectivity prevented them from getting a marriage certificate.
I can find a citation, and that now that you tell me we're dealing with state law, that's a totally different thing. And I have those references right here.
Okay.
Thank you, Judy, because that was all my fault. For some reason, I had written down, when you were testifying, I had written down federal law. So,
Well,
thanks.
well, what was particularly interesting is that federal law brought up Indian law. So, I mean, the whole child marriage issues that Michael and I both found all had to, led off with what was happening in India.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow at 10 and then at 1.
You bet.
Thank you.